Well, greetings again, brethren. Good to see you all. Appreciate that hymn. Certainly a good time to focus on the law of God, commandments, but also this point about hating falsehood and loving right. That's a lot of what these days have to do with. I hope everybody's been having a wonderful feast of unleavened bread, and that you haven't been surprised by any leavening sneaking up on you as you've been out and about, or just finding something unintentionally at home. But you know, if you do, you just need to put it out. But of course, more importantly, maybe you're surprised or come across some wrong thinking or attitude or thing you're doing that's wrong, the spiritual leavening that we need to put out. And we often think of that as sin, but it's also a way of thinking that leads to sin. These are different ways of thinking of leavening. Leavening is a corrupting influence in life, and it can lead things that lead us down a wrong road. As part of that, and I want you to turn over, if you will, to Luke chapter 12 right now. Luke chapter 12. And I want to note here in verse 1 of Luke chapter 12 something that Jesus said to his disciples, and we'll look at a few versions of this, different ways that this is rendered in the Gospels. But in Luke chapter 12, verse 1, it says, "In the meantime, when an innumerable multitude of people had gathered together, so that they trampled one another," as there was all these people coming together. But this is also, I think, a reference to something we'll read about in a moment. But it says, "He began to say to his disciples, first of all, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." And then he explains that, there's nothing covered or hidden that will not be revealed. And that's interesting too, because you think about hypocrisy and what that actually means, which is the word hypocrisy is actually a word that means, literally, hypokrites means behind the mask. It means looking from behind a mask. You have a sort of a hidden face on what you're doing. And that's what, or basically that was the word for actors of that day, because the actors on stage in Greco-Roman plays would wear these masks. You see the happy face for the comedy, and the sad or staid face for drama, and these are these masks that they would wear at that time, and it was not really showing you the real person there. And they had, voice affectation. They would change who they were. So there was a presentation of themselves that was different from reality, and that certainly is an important focus here. So again, beware of the leaven or the yeast in that context of that day of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Now we're given more detail over it, and I want you to notice this. It says of the Pharisees here, but if you look over in Matthew 16, flip over there, Matthew 16. And verse 5, it tells us, I better get my timer going. Somehow missed that. If we look here in verse 5, it tells us in Matthew 16:5, "Now when his disciples had come to the other side of Galilee there, they had forgotten to take bread, and Jesus said to them, 'Take heed and beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees.'" And they reasoned among themselves, saying, "Is it because we've taken no bread?" But Jesus, is aware, says, "Well, oh, you have little faith. Why do you reason among yourselves?" By the way, faith, there's 4 times you'll find this, "Oh, you have little faith." And there's a different thing he says each time, like about the seek first the kingdom of God. There it's talking about reasoning, or it's talking about worrying. Why do you worry about tomorrow? Oh, you have little faith. Another place, "Why did you doubt?" To Peter there at as he was sinking in the water, "Oh, you of little faith." Here, it's about reasoning among yourselves, human reason. You've got fear, doubt, worry, human reason. These are enemies of faith. They're things that that actually hurt and destroy faith. And of course, obedience and following God comes from belief and from faith. So these are things that are going to work contrary to that. And so he's this sense of human reason. Doesn't mean we never reason, by the way. But the idea is reasoning among themselves instead of reasoning from what he had done and told them. And he says, don't you yet understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000, the many baskets, or the 7 loaves of the 4,000. So he's talking about these great miracles that he just done in providing bread, and they should have been able to get it. How is it you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, but to beware the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees? And then they understood that he did not tell them to beware the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine, that is the teaching, is what that means, of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So this is another aspect to this. So it's teaching. So is it teaching or is it hypocrisy? Well, it's evidently both, or together, teaching that amounts to hypocrisy or that leads to it. Now, we'll keep this in mind. I want you also to look over at Mark chapter 8. And actually, we are going to come back over here to Matthew, but we're going to be in many places, so I'm not going to necessarily say to hold your place in one spot, but we are coming back to Matthew in a little bit. But Mark 8 is another account of this, and it says in verses 13. I'm sorry, I'm in Matthew. Mark 8. And of course, Mr. Dobson went through this recently, but Mark 8:13 through 21, we read here, and he left them, and getting into the boat again, departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than 1 loaf with them in the boat. Then he charged them, saying, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. So that's interesting. Now we see the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, which is not mentioned in the other places. So we get the leaven of the Pharisees. One says Pharisees and Sadducees, and this one says Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But they reason among themselves, saying, is because we have no bread. But Jesus, being aware, said to them, why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? And what just happened? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and many baskets full fragments, how many did you take up? They said 12. And when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of fragments did you take up? And they said 7. So he said, how is it you do not understand? Well, we see when we were reading that in Matthew 16, it explains that, they did get it then. They did understand, but it's very interesting here. So he's asking them, why don't you understand? Your heart's still hardened? How do you not understand? But, the other place it says they did get it then when he drew that to their attention, so that's good. Now, Herod, was the king over the Jewish people. Actually, he was mainly in Galilee at that time and some other areas around that. He was the son of Herod the Great. Herod had a few sons, and maybe I should say a few sons left at the end, but that were ruling over various areas. And Herod Antipas is who this is likely who is meant here. There is some discussion about that. There are also people that followed Herod called the Herodians, kind of a loyalist party among the teachers. And Herod doesn't seem to fit himself with this idea of teaching, but maybe the Herodians do. But it's maybe not just this sense of teaching. It's a sort of a way you're presenting yourself and a way that you are approaching things. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But some also, I should mention, equate the Sadducees and the Herodians, because they say, well, here it's substituted out. Herod is in place of the Sadducees. So the Sadducees were basically the priestly party. And there's, the contention is they weren't as religious as the Pharisees, and they were more like these Herod's people. Well, I don't think they, but they do have things in common. But there's also things in common with the Pharisees in what I think Jesus is talking about here. Brethren, I want to look more closely at what Jesus meant by the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees and of Herod. I'll look more closely at what Jesus meant by the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees and of Herod. These were different and against each other, but they had some major factors in common. And you might be surprised at this title, but I will explain going forward. It is called The Leaven of Lording It Over. The leaven of lording it over. Now, what this comes down to, and I think we can see this in all these cases with them, is abusing authority. It's actually about abusing other people through your authority. And we'll see this in the imagery of yeast in the dough and even the meaning of the word for leavened bread in Hebrew. They might say, well, what about hypocrisy? Well, we'll see that. It's like the old Prego spaghetti sauce commercials. It's in there. It's part of it. Definitely part of it, big part of it. But I want to start with a general prescription against leaven during the days of unleavened bread. If you look back over to Exodus 12 and 13 real quickly, I just want to note a couple things here. Exodus 12 and 13 is where we see this directive to observe the days of unleavened bread. But we're actually told in verse 15 of Exodus 12, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. And that is the Hebrew word matzah. You know, like you think of matzos, but it's matzah. And in fact, the feast in Hebrew is called Hag HaMatzah, Feast of the Unleavened, of the unleavened bread in that sense. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses, and whoever eats leavened bread from the first day of the seventh until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. Now, the word for leaven is basically in that day meant yeast, and it's the word seor. But the word for leavened bread is the word chametz. It's the word chametz. It's kind of the opposite of matzah. Matzah is the humble, flat bread. Chametz is the puffed up leavened bread. That's what we're talking about here. With the because of the yeast that is infused the dough. And we are to be taking in matzah or unleavened bread. We are to be putting out chametz. Now the Jews understood leaven as a negative symbol. And they got that from one place, and I'll have you flip over to Leviticus 2. Leviticus 2 is where God told them very specifically. And he had, by the way, at the end of the book of Exodus, in a couple of places, he had told them, you will not offer leaven with my sacrifice. And he was referring to the Passover. But when you come here to Leviticus 2, in verse 11, you find that you were never to offer a burnt offering of leavening. No grain offering which you shall bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven, for you shall burn no leaven, nor any honey in any offering to the Lord made by fire. Because it was, again, they understood that it was something not good. That now you do have the Pentecost offering that had leaven, and the there's other ones where you like in a certain peace offering you would have leaven, but that leaven that was offered was not allowed to be burnt on the altar. That was actually unacceptable. So you have this this negative connotation and that they saw there, that there's some problem that God's not accepting of leaven to be burned in offering to him. And why not? What is this about? Well, interestingly, something I just realized going through some research on this, the Hebrew term chametz which is in Strong's number 2556 and then 2557, another close cognate, has the sense of sharp or sour taste, like a sourdough, like sour bread in that sense, but also, I guess, sour behavior, being cruel or ruthless or oppressing. And in fact, look over at Psalm 71, if you will. Psalm 71. And we read verse 4. It says, "Deliver me, O my God, out of the hand of the wicked." Might think of Paul talking about the putting out the old leaven of malice and wickedness. And here we have, "Deliver me out of the hand of the wicked, out of the hand of the unrighteous and cruel man." Cruel is the word chametz. Is this sour bread. And so we got a sour bread man, basically, is what we're talking about here. And so we want to be delivered from that. Really, you're talking about somebody who's abusive and does bad and harm to others. Turn to Isaiah chapter 1. Isaiah chapter 1, verses 16 and 17 we'll read. "Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, put away the evil of your doings from before my eyes." That's what God's telling the nation. And certainly this is definitely a unleavened bread type message, this sense of coming out of evil and sin. "Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Rebuke the oppressor." And by the way, I think the King James has "relieve the oppressed," but actually, I was going through a study on this, and the Kyle and Delitzsch commentary, they go through the Hebrew, and others say that's definitely wrong in the King James. The New King James is right, and so are others that translate this as rebuking the oppressor. This is against the oppressor. "Defend the fatherless and plead for the widow." Actually, it could also be like making straight the oppressor. In other words, straightening out the oppressor, dealing with the oppressor, in other words. But what is this word oppressor? This word is chametz. Again, okay, this is again this idea of this sour bread, which is very interesting. And by the way, this was a surprise to me, but just looking at this, I just told you 2556 and 2557, but the word right before that is another cognate of this word. It is 2555, and that word is Hamas. Hamas, which I've mentioned before, is violence. It's like what, God tells Edom, for Hamas against your brother Jacob, which is very interesting because Hamas is the name of a terrorist group. And actually in Hebrew and in Arabic, it has that sense of that. Now in the Arabic sense, it's more like of a glorified fighting, but in Hebrew, it's violence. And that word is translated violence, Hamas, several times in the Bible. But is also translated with these terms. Is translated wrong. Is translated cruelty. Is translated false. In false witnesses. False witnesses are Hamas witnesses. It is translated unjust or damage or oppression or oppressor. So it has this very similar sense in this usage. The sense, again, is a sour treatment, maltreatment, or harm. Also in the sense, some have argued of a corruption, like a spreading corruption in the way that yeast works. And it's like spreading its rot, through through what it goes through. So this is very interesting. Now, no wonder Paul, let's look at 1 Corinthians 5. No wonder Paul worded 1 Corinthians 5 in the way that he did. Now, a lot of times we're going to, think, well, the Jews sort of had no idea. They were doing these things with leavened and unleavened bread, and they didn't really understand the meaning. And there's certain things they didn't understand in relation to Christ, of course. But this idea that they didn't understand the meaning, and that Paul was directly inspired by God to say this, what he did here in 1 Corinthians 5, in a way that was completely not understood in the Jewish community. And that's actually false. I believe the Jewish community did understand that leavening represented something bad and a corrupting influence. And in fact, what they referred to it as in later writings we see, but it goes back further, this idea of the Yetzer Hara, this idea of the evil inclination. That's what they saw that the leaven represented. It was the aspect of a person that would go the wrong way. So it's doing wrong and doing harm in that sense. And they put that together because of the prohibition in the sacrifices and the meaning and usage of chametz and its close cognates in the language. So they could kind of put this all together. So in 1 Corinthians 5, 1 through 2, Paul is talking about a bad situation in Corinth. He says it's actually reported verse 1, it's actually reported there's sexual immorality among you. And such sexual immorality is not even named among the Gentiles, that a man has his father's wife, the stepmother. And you are puffed up and have not rather mourned. Because again, that's like, with the bread, that because they were very proud of their tolerance. We've gone through this before, but I want to move down to verse 6. Your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? And of course, that's the way this corrupting influence of yeast works through the dough. Therefore, this souring effect expands and extends. Therefore, purge out the old leaven. Get rid of that starter dough, which has that you keep reusing to start each new leavening batch. Get rid of that you may be a new lump, since you truly or literally are unleavened, because there's the days of unleavened bread. For indeed Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice, doing harm to others. And this is quite astounding if you think about the meaning of this in Hebrew. That's what he's saying. He's not just calling this by chance. I think his words are very carefully chosen here. This leaven of malice and wickedness. It's broad. And actually, I think it also has in this sense the sense of, there's a difference between trespass and sin. And sin is sort of a general quality of going against God. But trespasses are specific wrongs that you do. And that's kind of what we're seeing here, that we've got like this unleavened bread signifies the particular wrongs as well as the general overall wrong and departure from God. And so that's on the one hand, but opposite that, of course, we see what we're supposed to have, which is instead of that, we're to have the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth, the unleavened of sincerity and truth. So we've got harm and abuse or oppression and evil on one hand, and we've got sincerity and truth on the other hand, the opposite of false and lying, standing up for truth and openness. Sincerity is the opposite of hypocrisy, if you will, in that sense. There's no hidden agenda in that sense. You're very open and forthright. Now I want to get more of the context for what Jesus said about the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees and of Herod. I'll get you to turn. Actually, I won't have you turn to this one. I'll have you turn to Matthew 14. But while you're turning there, I'm just going to note this about John 6. The feeding of the 5,000, by the way, is mentioned in all four of the gospel accounts. And when John mentions it in John chapter 6, verses 1 through 14, it's noted there in John 6:4 that the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. So this was in the context of coming up on Passover. So there was actually a lesson, I think, in what was happening there, even though this was just evidently prior to the Passover. But nevertheless, it was setting a picture that was going to be useful in that context. And that's there's two things that happened, of course. It wasn't just the feeding of the 5,000. It's things that Jesus said right after that, which I'll mention in a moment. But we look at Matthew 14, we see this as well. And it's followed first by, and this is also mentioned in John, it's followed by Jesus walking on the sea, and that whole episode that happens there, where Peter actually comes out briefly on the water as well. But then, sorry, I should have put a marker there. There we go. So we have verses 13 through 21, this whole issue of the feeding of the 5,000. And this is a great miracle. And it was, when it says 5,000, by the way, that's besides women and children. So there's a lot more than 5,000 people here. A great deal more, and maybe there were those people, spread the word to others. I'm sure this news got around that this had happened. It was quite astounding. And it also, not everybody knew what immediately followed with Peter on the sea, but I don't know how many people got told that right away. But that's also, of course, a big deal that let them know who they were dealing with. They had seen him perform this great miracle, and then they saw this walking on the sea, and they realized, you're the Son of God. This is really the real deal here. And then he gets over to Capernaum, it says in John 6, and I'm not going to have you turn there, but I'm just going to note a couple things. That's where he gives the bread of life address, and he starts addressing these people. Well, you're just here for the food. He ends up in the synagogue there, and most of what he had to say there was in the synagogue of Capernaum. It actually mentions that. But in going through this, he references the manna. Your fathers, ate the manna in the wilderness, but they died. And why is he bringing that up? Well, he's bringing that up because he has just fed them with miraculous bread from heaven, in a sense. He's given them this bread from God in the feeding of the 5,000, and it was a great miracle that provided for the people. And there were many things that Jesus did which were duplicating the acts of great prophets of old, including Moses. And remember, he was supposed to be there as what Moses was told, there will be a prophet who will arise like you. And the people are supposed to follow him. And that would be him. And he was coming and he did that great work of giving the people food like Moses. But there was more to it than that, because he made the point that, well, that manna in the wilderness, that's not sufficient. Even what I just gave, is not really sufficient. What you really need is me. He's saying, I am the true bread from heaven. I came down to give my flesh for the world. He is the true bread. He says you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood, or you have no life in you. And then in going through this, he says, you're not going to survive unless you feed on me. And of course, people were very confused by all of this. But it becomes clear in the discussion that he's, and what happens later in the accounts, we know he's talking about giving his life for the world in his sacrifice, but we also know he's talking about the essence of who and what he is his character and life, which is exemplified through his teachings, Jesus Christ's teachings and example, which was itself a teaching, and the whole of his words, which are found not just in what he said during his ministry, but in the whole Bible, because he is the author. He is the one who wrote this on behalf of the Father. He is the one who gave us this scriptures, and he is actually the one who is the Word of God, the living Word. And the Bible is the Word of God in print. So we, in reading and studying the scriptures, we are that way feeding on Christ. We are learning him. We are taking him in to our life. And as he said to them, the flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak to you, they are spirit, they are life. And the words was the whole Word of God. And Peter acknowledged, where else will we go? You have the words of eternal life. So that's all very important context leading up to what happens next, which I will have you turn to in Matthew 15 here, is in the next chapter after the feeding of 5,000, and this would have been after the this situation there at the Bread of Life speech and all that happened there. But in chapter 15 it says, "Then the scribes and Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus, saying, 'Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread.'" Which is astounding. I was just thinking about this. Look at what Jesus just did with bread and all that he just said about bread. And they're going, "Why don't your disciples wash their hands when they eat bread?" It's just quite it's quite a turning of the eating of bread on its head. If you think about it in this context. He answered and said to them, "Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, saying, 'Honor your father and mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death.' But you say, 'Whoever says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift to God.'" In other words, I'm donating this over here and I really can't help you. Mother, father, that's pretty sad. He says, you think you're obeying God, but you're actually doing something against what God gave in the Ten Commandments. And then he need not honor his father or mother, they reason. "Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Hypocrites." Notice that. Hypocrites. This is hypocrisy. "Well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, 'These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" And so then he explains to his, the multitude, it's not what goes into the mouth, it's what comes out in that sense, is the defiling. And then his disciples asked, "Do you know the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?" Okay, yeah, they were offended because they knew he was talking about them. But he answered and said, "Every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind leads the blind, both will fall into a ditch." Now, I want to note something about this because this is part of the whole thing. Yes, there was a hypocrisy that they were doing here because they were, setting up their authority by their tradition, but not following the commandments. That is an important aspect of this. But there's something else here too. Well, what were they doing here? Well, we need to come here and set things right. We're bringing the benefit of this their great sage wisdom. Okay, Jesus said you don't get it at all. You're not even obeying God. You're not even obeying the commandments. But they came because they think, well, we need to present the way this ought to be. You guys are doing it the wrong way. We've got the right way. As if that's supposed to be helpful, right? They're going to come and they're going to help these others to obey in the right way. That is another aspect of this hypocrisy. It's not just the hypocrisy of, well, they say they're following God, but they're really getting around it. They say that they're here to teach God's way, to lead people, to help them, but what they're really trying to do is show off their wisdom and get people to submit to them. I mean, that's the real mission that they have here, and it's not a good one, and it is hypocrisy, because it is a false pretense and setting up what they're doing in different terms. But if you continue here, Jesus shows that they are blind guides, because that's what they're really trying to be. They're trying to be the guides, okay? But Jesus says you're blind guides, so you're not really what you are claiming to be. The guides help people, but these guides are going to lead people right into the ditch, and it's pretty sad. Now, continuing on at the end of this chapter in verses 32 through 35, we get to the feeding of the 4,000. So it's another great miracle Jesus does, and it's a similar one. But and I won't go into all the meaning of that. There is evidently some meaning to where these were done and how many baskets were taken up. But suffice it to say, this was a great miracle. And by the way, it was a repeat in a bit of a sense from something that was done many years before at the time of Elisha. He had fed like 100 people with some, but not even close to this. This is twice Jesus did something massive. So here now Jesus has done things like Moses and the great prophets of old, like Elijah, and he's doing these things that they should have been able to get the point. So what do we see in chapter 16 then, following right on the heels of that? Let's look in verses 1 through 4. Then the Pharisees and Sadducees, so now they both show up, came and testing him asked that he would show them a sign from heaven. I mean, just think of this for a second. He's just fed the 5,000 and then the 4,000. And by the way, in both cases, that was only the men. There was many more thousands. And this got around. This was known. This was astounding stuff. And there was other astounding stuff that Jesus did, and people knew about it. So these guys, so the first guys show up, and they're saying, after the first miracle, they show up and it says, well, why are your disciples eating bread with unwashed hands? And now they show up and they're saying, why? Show us a sign. It's like, are you kidding me? What are you talking about? There had obviously been a sign, and that's why Jesus in a minute is going to tell his disciples, didn't you get what I did? Even they were kind of floating into that a little bit. But he says, he answered and said to them, when it's evening, you say it'll be fair weather, for the sky's red. And in the morning, it'll be foul weather today, for the sky's red and threatening. Red sky in morning, sailors take warning. Red sky at night, sailors delight. This is just a general idea that they had this way that they could sort of see what was going on with the weather. But he says, hypocrites, again, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. Why is that a hypocrisy? Because they should have known better. And in fact, they definitely knew better. Remember Nicodemus came early on, and he says, teacher, we know that you're a teacher sent from God, because nobody could do this if they weren't from God. And this was well known through all these people. And this is pretty pathetic that they come and they're saying, well, show us some sign. And he says, a wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. No sign will be given except the sign of the prophet Jonah. He left them and departed. Now, he already mentioned that in Matthew 12 about the sign of Jonah, but there was more. And there was more to that, by the way, than just Jesus being dead 3 days and 3 nights in the grave. And if you look in Luke, the whole idea is that Jonah went to basically pagans for 40 days and 40 nights, and they repented. But these people, they were not repentant. And this is pretty astounding. These guys are looking, for this sign. He just done these great miracles. But these guys are the authorities. Okay, this is the key. He needs to submit to their review. Because after all, that is going to be better for all to get their approval. He needs their sanction. Well, he says no. They have enough to figure it out, but they're refusing to. So he's out of there. He does not need to go by what by their approval. He's not going to be subject to their review and scrutiny, to their judgment of him. It is an outrage, actually. He is the judge of the earth, by the way. And this was already very clear, and it should have been understood. Now, again, in verses 5 through 12, it says that, again, we looked at this a while ago, but I'm going to drill down on a couple of things here. The disciples, had forgotten to take bread, and so Jesus says, take heed and beware the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, and they think, wow, we didn't take bread, so he's getting honest about that. And he said to them, oh, you have little faith. Again, there was a faith issue here too, of not, why do you reason among yourselves? And again, that's an enemy of faith, human reason against God, because you brought no bread. Don't you get it? Don't you understand what I did with these loaves of the for the 5,000 and the 4,000? How is it you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, but to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees? And then they got that he was talking about their teaching. Well, he was talking about their teaching, and that's true. But there were other aspects of this, The disciples were not thinking by what God had shown. And actually, in that way, they were following an aspect of the Pharisees and Sadducees' problem, which was a faithless reliance on themselves, missing what was right in front of them. But thankfully, they got it now. Now, we turn over to the parallel in Mark 8, and I'd like you to do that. Turn back over to Mark 8. We were there earlier. And again, there's a certain teaching in what the Pharisees are doing, but the teaching isn't just all the stuff that they're saying. It's about promoting themselves. I mean, part of their teaching is that they should be able to say yay or nay on this stuff. And Jesus says, I don't think so. It's not up to you. It's already testified to in what I've done. And he says that in other places, the works testify for me. He's made that very clear. And the scriptures testify for him. And and these are all the testimony he needs. He's done it, and it's according to the scriptures, and that should be enough. And really, it should be enough for everyone, and including us, brethren, even though we're far removed in time. There's a lot of evidence that shows us that that is the case. Now, if we look in here in Mark 8, again, we're in verses 13 through 21. Again, the disciples forgot to take bread, and he told them, take heed, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod this time. And it says, and they reason, it's because we've taken no bread. But Jesus says, why do you reason because you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive nor understand? Is your heart still hardened? I want to say a couple things here before I get to what that's about. So I'm going to back up to this point about Herod. Again, this is Herod Antipas, was the ruler of that time. And I'll just reference for you back in Mark 3, verse 6, it actually says that the Pharisees plotted with the Herodians how to destroy Jesus, which is very interesting. These people hated each other, by the way. The Pharisees and the Herodians, they were not on friendly terms, but they could agree on something. We got to get that Jesus guy. Got to get him. We got to destroy him because he is dangerous. He is dangerous. He's dangerous to their positions. And we're going to see that a little bit more too. But also, I want you to look at Mark chapter 6. Hold your place here and flip back a couple chapters to Mark chapter 6. We see something about Herod himself. In Mark chapter 6, it's interesting, we read about, now King Herod heard of him, of Jesus, for his name had become well known, and he said, well, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. So he thought, well, he had John put to death. And it talks a little bit about that. And others were saying, well, it's Elijah. And others says, it's the prophet or one of the prophets. And when Herod heard, he said, this is John, whom I beheaded. He's been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her, shouldn't have. And John had spoken against it, verse 18, because John said to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. Verse 20, this is the key here. I want to note this. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. He liked to go and talk to John. And even when he had him in prison, he wants to hear from John. What do you have to say, from God? And it reminds me of, in the Old Testament, of Zedekiah, there at the time of the fall of Judah, who had, Jeremiah in prison. He kept going to him and trying to get, what does God say about this and that? And it's like he almost would do what he needed to, but then he wouldn't, he was almost, but no. And that ended up very badly for Zedekiah, and it all doesn't end well for Herod either. But Herod, it's interesting, he has this acknowledgement of who John is, that he's just and holy and he's a man of God. And let's think about the fact that Herod himself, he is supposed to be supposedly a Jewish king, although he's really Edomite heritage, but he's claiming to be a Jew. And he's ruling as a Roman authority. He's ruling for the Romans. He's a Jew who's ruling for the Romans. But now he's going in to hear this stuff from John, and he's trying to protect him, but then he's got him in prison. And eventually, this whole thing with Salome is sent by Herodias and gets Herod to agree to whatever she says, and what she wants is the head of John the Baptist. Actually, that's what her mother wanted, but she went ahead with that. And so then he has him killed, which is awful, right? But what was going on here? Well, he was more concerned about his honor before his courtiers, basically, in keeping his word to Salome, than he was for preserving the life of who he knew was a man of God. So he ended up having him killed. He's the one who had him killed. But in Luke 9:9, I'll just reference for you also, Herod wanted to see Jesus, it says. And in chapter 23, verse 8 of Luke 23:8, at the end there, it says, he desired a long time to see him and hoped to see some miracle done by him. But at the time, this is when Jesus was on trial, and Jesus would not do anything. He wouldn't even say anything before Herod, because he was not given any respect to that at all. And he was not going to be made a show of. And that's really what Herod kind of wanted. He wanted like some interesting excitement, some enticement, something. But I mean, there was enough proof. Again, he had plenty. That Herod, I mean, it says he heard what Jesus was doing. He already knew about that. He knew. He had lots of spies, and they were well aware of what was going on. And he had many reports, and so it was quite obvious what was happening. But as in the case with John, he chose not to repent when it came to Jesus. He was promoting himself as a ruler for God. Like Herod the Great, his father, built up the temple. He also built some pagan temples too, but he built built a temple to Caesar, I guess. He built the temple of God like he's some great devotee of the true God. But along with that came a whole lot of blasphemy and other sin. And the same is true with Herod Antipas. And his people, these Herodians, this party that supported him, they were out to trap and destroy Jesus with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And again, I'll just note about them that, the Sadducees, you've got the Pharisees. They were a very meticulous religious party. They didn't follow everything that's in Scripture, but they added a lot of stuff, very legalistic. I think it started as this idea of keeping a fence around the law, like we want to protect people from breaking the law, but it became all this minutia of all these things you had to or couldn't do, and it became ludicrous. Like you can't walk on the grass because that's going to break the blades of grass, and that's threshing, and you're not allowed to do threshing work on the Sabbath. I mean, it's absolutely absurd, the lengths they went to. But again, these were things that they could, make sure other people were doing. They could check up on them and keep them in their sights. Well, the Sadducees, the priestly party, basically, they were not like that. Actually, they only accepted the first 5 books of the Bible, but you think they'd be very meticulous about the law then, but they weren't. They were basically that. Why? Because they didn't even really believe in an afterlife in that sense. They actually had this concept of your reward is in this life, and the wealth and blessings you receive now is what you get for following the Torah. So that's what we do. We just are going to do that, except that many of them, since it wasn't really for eternity, they didn't care that much. And if there was a way to swindle and get what they wanted here in this earthly life, they would do that. And of course, that was definitely the way the political rulers lived, and the Herods and the whole Herodian party and all these politicking, and basically it was they lived in a society where they could take advantage of other people for their own well-being. And it's a pretty disgusting thing what was happening there all around. And so you've got this this attempt to try to destroy Jesus by them. And then in Mark 12, I'll note this, what it says about the Herodians and the Pharisees. It says in Mark 12, verses, and again, the wording is very interesting, verses 13 and 14, it says, "Then they sent to him some of the Pharisees and the Herodians." Okay, so now we got this party from Herod as well as the Pharisees, who are, again, deathly odds against one, they at odds against one another, and yet they're teamed up now. They're tag teaming, okay? And it says, to catch him in his words. That's what they're doing. And when they had come, they said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are true and care about no one," not meaning he has no care for people, but meaning he doesn't care about these others' opinions that are supposed to be judging him. "For you do not regard the person of men, but teach the way of God in truth." That's the setup. We know that you'd say exactly what God, from God. That's what we know. And by the way, they did know that. That's the sad part of this. But they kind of argued against it in their minds. And so what did they say? "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Shall we pay or shall we not pay?" But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, "Why do you test me?" And so he showed him up. But the point was, they were hypocrites in the way they were dealing there, because they were professing, again, that he was this righteous teacher and they were following what he would say and they want his opinion. But really what they want to do is trap him and destroy him. That was their goal, again and again. They were actors. They were hiding what they were doing. They were hypocrites. And they were doing that for the sake of their position and power. That's what this was really about. Again, they all knew about the feeding of the multitudes and the other miracles. If we go, back in Mark 8, in verses 17 through 19, remember that's where Jesus said to his disciples, "Is your heart still hardened? Having eyes, do you not see?" What is he telling them? You need to not be as these others who have hardened their hearts, refusing to see. That's what's going on here. They're hardening their hearts. Well, this is an interesting time frame too, because that recalls the Pharaoh of the Exodus, okay? A major symbol of tyrannical power and oppression, who, continually, he was at the verge of acting, but his heart was hardened. And there was a pride there, and also a maintaining of position of himself as a god under all the gods of Egypt. And this was part of a false tyrannical system. And that's what was sort of happening here among the Jews. They were promoting a false tyrannical system, and they were wanting to maintain their part in it. Jesus did not want his disciples setting themselves up as such an authority, but to be submissive and yielded to him and to his teaching, and to believe what he was doing, and to make it, for that to be clear. We get to turn over to Matthew 23. This is where we have the excoriation of the scribes and Pharisees. The scribes basically were people who copied the law, but they also taught the law, and they were closely association with the Pharisees. And by the way, you had Pharisees and Sadducees. There was the leading Pharisees and people of the priestly Sadducee party made up the Sanhedrin, which was the governing council of the land, which was headed up by the high priest. I'll just mention that because it's going to come up here in a minute. But in this case, he's excoriating the scribes and Pharisees. And he says the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, and I think that's to do with in the synagogue, place of the synagogue where the law was read. And therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they see and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. Now, here's the thing. They were very meticulous, and they bound all this on other people. You say, well, weren't they doing that? Well, I think they did do some things to be seen of others, but it wasn't really for serving God. And that's a big key here. There was a lot of what they were doing was for show. And in this case, they were not really about obeying God in these things that they put on other people. And we think, well, that's the hypocrisy. They were doing things, they were claiming you need to do stuff that they weren't doing, and that there is some truth in that. But there's more than that. It says, but all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad, large the borders of their garments. They love the best places, or the places of honor. The place of honor, you know, these chief seats. The best seats in the synagogues. They want to be in the power positions. That's what this is really about. And they love the greetings in the marketplace and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. Rabbi is a word that means basically my great master. I mean, that's the idea of this term, but it means a teacher. But really, it's, you know, it comes from this idea of somebody who's basically your Lord. And he said, Jesus says, but you do not be called Rabbi. He wants his disciples to not do that. For one is your teacher, really, the Christ, and you are all brethren. That's the way they're supposed to be. And this was how the nation was really supposed to be, but they were not following that. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called teachers. And he's talking about in this sense of a rabbi, a master, a ruler of their life. For one is your teacher, the Christ. And we don't use that as a religious title. But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. He who humbles himself will be exalted. Okay, this is very interesting because, you know, why would they like this, you know, in their hypocrisy? You know, they wanted to look good, and they wanted to look important to others, to sit in judgment of others, to control others. This was their objective. And actually, I'll just note also that if you go through the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, and this is in Matthew 5 through 7, he keeps talking about, don't be like the hypocrites who do these various things. Well, who's he talking about? He's talking about these same people. And he's saying, you know, they utter many prayers to be heard. You know, they want to be seen by men. They openly do all their charitable works, and they blow the trumpet. You know, and he says, they have their reward, and they pray. You know, they want to be making loud prayers on the corner. And he says that they fast, they make themselves disfigured so that everybody knows they're fasting, and they're spiritual. They want everybody to know, and that, again, Jesus says they have their reward. And also he says they're not to be judging others and to be forgiving. These people were not doing that. They were very judgmental, and they were not forgiving. And this was all part of their shtick. You know, they were the authorities who, you know, needed other people to submit to them. All these people, by the way, scribes and Pharisees, Sadducees, Herod, the Herodians, they were all about maintaining their power over others and their judgment of others, even as part of an evil regime. And here in verse 11, we just read, Jesus said something important. He's explaining to them, don't be like this. Instead, he who is greatest among you shall be your servant. And he who exalts himself will be humbled. He who humbles himself will be exalted. You know, Jesus said other things like this. Kind of reminds us, if you will, turn over to Luke 22. Luke 22, something we, you know, see also at the Passover. This was at the Passover, and it's not the only time this came up. But of course, it came up at our Passover, but as a joke, thankfully. Who's the greatest? You know, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? But I want us to notice something here. Luke 22, verses 24 through 27 says, now there was a dispute among them, the disciples, as to which of them should be considered the greatest. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, or lord it over them, others, you know, place says. And those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. Benefactors. What's that all about? Well, these rulers say, we're ruling for your good. You know, they want to appear right and helpful. I mean, they're so needed, right? Everybody needs these people to tell them what to do. And that is what these lords and rulers of the Gentiles would do. But this is also, brethren, what the Pharisees and the Sadducees and Herod were doing. They were all doing this. This is the way of the world. This is the way of the devil, basically. Ruling, and it's all a lie. I want us to notice that. Benefactors, what a joke. As we pilfer, as we rob from you, as we take what's yours, as we lead you and gain ourselves respect and honor, we promote ourselves. That's what's really happening here. It was all a lie. That's the hypocrisy. That's a huge hypocrisy of human governance, in a sense, is that, you know, we're the government and we're here to help. I mean, and that's what was happening with these people. And Jesus says, don't be like that. But not so among you. Verse 26, on the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger. He who governs as he who serves. For who is greater, he who sits at the table or the one who serves? Is not he who sits at the table, you know, being served in that sense? Yet I am among you as the one who serves. That's how we need to be. He's setting the pattern. He's the God of creation. And he's being a servant. That doesn't mean he doesn't have authority. He has all authority. But yet the way he exercises that authority is not to lord it over others. It is to help others to become like him. It's quite astounding if you really think about his purpose in that and what he's doing. And so these guys are doing this horrible thing of saying they're here to help. But what are they really doing? They're, extending, they're extending their own power over others. It itself is like a leaven, an encroaching leaven, a corruption that's seeping and creeping and extending their power over others to the point of killing the Messiah when he came. Here was somebody who was endangering their power. And I want us to see that directly in John 11. And I'm going to finish up here in a minute. But John 11, 45, let's look at that. John 11. And it says in verse 45, then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and seen, that is, just talking about the time of after he rose, after he called Lazarus out of the grave, they came to see her, but now they saw Lazarus raised from the dead, and they believed in him. Verse 46, but some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things Jesus did. Jesus just raised someone from the dead out of the grave after 4 days. And then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council. It's very official. And they said, and so basically this is like a Sanhedrin, because it's these chief priests and the Pharisees. And they said, what shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him. Not us, or at least we refuse to. And here's the key, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation. And, one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest, says, you know nothing at all. You don't consider that it's expedient for us that one man should die for the people and not that the whole nation should perish. And, of course, that was a prophecy intended by him. He was just intending, we got to get rid of this guy who is a problem because he is causing a problem for our position and power and our country. But did they really care about their country, which was under Roman dominance, as much as they did their power over it? Because they thought as long as we're here kind of guiding things, it's good because we guide it the way it should be guided. And it's a pretty terrible thing, all of this. This is all a terrible leavening, brethren. That is what this is. And it's a great hypocrisy as a way, but it's a lording it over in a hypocritical way. All these officials were very concerned about their position. They didn't want somebody to rock the boat. It reminds of the Exodus story. Moses came as a type of Christ to deliver the Israelites, but the Egyptian taskmasters set Hebrew overseers over the Israelites. So in this pagan governance, like Rome, but now back in Egypt, there were Israelites who were set over other Israelites. And those guys were concerned about their positions and their well-being within the framework of Egyptian bondage. And I'll just reference for you Exodus 5, verses 20 through 21. It says they came out from, as they came out from Pharaoh, they met Moses and Aaron. That's these officers of the Israelites who were told, you need to start making the bread without the straw. But they stood there to meet Moses and Aaron, and they said to him, let the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us. That is very similar to this thing that was going on with these Jewish leaders about Jesus. Basically, you're putting a sword in the hand of the Romans to come and take us out. And we don't like that. And so we are going to stand against you despite everything that we see, which is all the evidence that there could possibly be that the Messiah has come. And it was made clear that, he was there to teach them. At least they knew he was from God, even if they couldn't quite accept the Messiah thing. But he said that he was, and they should have been able to put it together. At least these Israelites didn't plot to kill Moses, though there would be some rebellions to follow, and I think there was some attempts to do that. There were various aspects to the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees and of Herod. They all espoused wrong ideas, promoted some wrong things. The Pharisees are very legalistic, teaching as doctrine human traditions and rules, while the Sadducees and Herod and the Herodians were looser, even lax in their approach, more accepting of Greek and Roman ways. Except for all, there was great demand for keeping the status quo of power under the Romans, so as to be able to lord that power over others, to control others, to oppress others for those others' supposed good. This kind of attitude, God's ministry must avoid. All of us as God's people and representatives must avoid. And I'll just throw out in closing here, in Revelation 3, where it talks about the Laodiceans, we think, well, they were just very lax. I don't think they were just very lax. I think they were zealous about the wrong things. And one of those things was they said, well, I'm rich in increased goods, and I have need of nothing. But Laodicea means the people judge. And I think it may mean the people were judgmental of others. While they thought they had their spiritual ducks in a row, they probably pointed the finger at other people. I don't have any need. I don't have any need for anything. You, on the other hand, I think, need to toe the line. So that's a very sad thing, and we need to make sure we don't fall into that. We must live truthfully and in real service to others, not from behind a false mask of supposedly serving others when we're really trying to look good, judge and control them, and serve ourselves. Rather than being concerned about who we're over, let's have more focus on who we're under and his desire that we serve all who are under him. Let us reject the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees and of Herod, a spreading corruption of abusing others under the hypocritical pretense of following God and helping them, and really do good by being people of sincerity and truth in serving God and others with a pure heart. Have a wonderful remainder of the Sabbath and the Feast of Unleavened Bread.